I sat at the end of the conference table and listened to my younger brother call me a cautionary tale. He didn't use those words. Marcus never does. He said it the way he says everything difficult sideways, with a half smile, while refilling someone else's glass. Nadia's been married to her career so long, they're practically common law at this point. The table laughed. I laughed too, because that was easier than the alternative, and because I had been laughing at variations of that joke for the better part of a decade. But something shifted that evening, the way ice shifts before it breaks, not dramatically, just a quiet structural giving way beneath the surface. I set down my water glass and said without raising my voice, "I've actually been married to a person for almost 9 years. His name is Owen. He's an architect." The laughter stopped. My mother's hand went still on the tablecloth. And Marcus, my younger brother Marcus, who had been leaning back in his chair with the comfortable authority of a man who has never once been the family's unanswered question. Let me tell you what kind of family produces that moment. My parents are not bad people. I want to say that plainly, because the story gets complicated, and I don't want the complications to do work they're not supposed to do. My father, Bertram, spent 28 years as a civil engineer with the city of Columbus, Ohio. My mother, Pauline, managed the administrative operations of a mid-sized pediatric practice for most of my childhood and adolescence. They are practical people. They are people who understand the world through what they can see, measure, and document. When Marcus married his college girlfriend at 26 and bought a house in a suburb 40 minutes from my parents' front door and produced a daughter within 2 years, that became the unit of measure. The ruler by which everything else in the family was sized. I am 4 years younger than Marcus. We were never particularly close, not hostile, just operating in parallel, like 2 hallways in the same building that don't share a wall. At family dinners we functioned fine. We passed things. We asked questions that were technically questions. But the subtext was always present, running beneath the conversation like water under pavement. What is Nadia doing? What I was doing was medical informatics. Specifically, I was building and implementing interoperability frameworks for hospital data systems across regional health networks. A job that sounds technical because it is, and that matters enormously, in ways that are genuinely impossible to explain over a holiday meal. When a trauma patient arrives at a hospital that can't access their medication history from the clinic across town, my work closed gaps. It had been closing gaps for 13 years, across 4 states, with a team I had built from 6 people to 41. My family's relationship with this career was, at best, politely uncomprehending. At worst, it was Marcus saying she's married to her work in a tone that treated this as a diagnosis. I stopped correcting them. It was simpler. I had other things to protect. I met Owen at an industry panel in Seattle 9.5 years ago. He was there representing a sustainable design firm that had just completed a hospital campus in Portland, a project that touched indirectly on the kind of data infrastructure I was being paid to evaluate. I asked him a question during the open discussion that he answered well, and then complicated in a way that made me want to argue with him. We argued over dinner. We argued until the restaurant started stacking chairs. We flew home to different cities, and continued arguing by text for 3 weeks until he flew to mine, ostensibly to see the city, but actually we both understood, because the argument had become something else. We were married 11 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, in a courthouse in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a city we had both always wanted to visit and had never managed to reach. 8 people attended: his sister and her husband, 2 of his colleagues from the firm, my closest friend from graduate school, and her partner and an officiant named George, who told us, while reviewing our paperwork, that he had been doing this for 19 years and still got emotional at the paperwork. Our case stage, which he found somewhat embarrassing. I did not invite my family. I did not tell them. I told myself this was a boundary. I told myself I was protecting something. I was partly. But I also need to be honest about what else was true. I had spent years watching the things I cared about become footnotes in my family's conversation, and I had found something I loved too much to offer it up for that. The years between the courthouse and that dinner table were not secret in any dark sense. Owen came to my professional events. He met my graduate school friends. He had opinions about my work and I had opinions about his, and we had built, gradually, a life in Denver that was layered and specific and completely deliberately ours. He had never met my parents. He had never met Marcus. This was our arrangement, mine, initially, and then ours by mutual understanding, and for most of those years it held. But there were costs I had not fully accounted for. When my father had a cardiac event 2 winters ago, I drove to Columbus alone and sat in a waiting room for 6 hours beside my mother, who thought I was alone because I was, and who kept saying you really shouldn't have to do this by yourself in the worried way she says things. Owen was reachable by phone, in constant contact, asking the right questions. But he wasn't there. And I couldn't explain why, because explaining would have required a conversation I wasn't ready to have. There were the phone calls from Marcus. "You're not seeing anyone?" "Mom worries." She doesn't say it, but she does. I told her, "You're just very focused on work." He said this with the practiced sympathy of someone who has genuinely convinced himself he is being kind. "There's a woman at Diane's office, she's 40, divorced, no kids, I think you'd actually have a lot in common." I let him believe what he needed to believe. I told myself it wasn't worth the conversation. It wasn't worth the conversation until it was. The dinner was a birthday celebration for my mother, a milestone she had specifically requested to be low-key, which meant 12 people, a catered spread, and Marcus arriving 45 minutes early to establish the emotional weather of the room. He was on his 3rd drink by the time I got there. His wife Dana gave me the particular look of a woman who has spent years watching her husband's family dynamics and has chosen careful neutrality as her survival strategy. I respected her for it. Marcus started, as he always started, with the casual diagnostic. "Nadia, you look exhausted. Are you sleeping?" He mentioned someone from his firm who had recently become single. He mentioned it twice. He said, when our mother was still in the kitchen, "I don't know why you make this so hard on yourself, honestly. You're not getting younger." And then loud enough for the table, "You're going to be 41 and still on your own. I just worry about you rattling around in that apartment by yourself." He said it with the warmth of someone who has confused surveillance for love. And then he reached for Dana's hand and squeezed it, the way people do when they want to illustrate a point without finishing the sentence. I set down my fork. I said, very quietly, "I'm not on my own. I've been married for almost 9 years. The silence that followed was not social. It was structural. It was the silence of a room in which something has shifted so completely that no one yet knows which way to move." My mother came in from the kitchen with a dish she set on the table without looking up. Then she looked up. I slid my phone across the table. Owen and I on the roof of the firm's Portland project, the city behind us in the late afternoon light. Owen at my department's recognition event last spring, his arm around me, both of us laughing at something my colleague had just said. Owen and me in Albuquerque 11 months after Seattle, in the courthouse lobby, him in the gray suit he had bought specifically for the occasion, me holding a small bunch of flowers that George the officiant had unexpectedly produced from a drawer. Marcus looked at the photos. Something moved through his face in sequence. Disbelief, then the quick recalculation of a person who is finding that the story they have been telling doesn't fit the evidence. Then something harder and more defensive. "Why?" he said, and stopped. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" I looked at him. I had prepared for this question, the way you prepare for something you know is coming, quietly, over years, running through the different versions of the answer and deciding which one was actually true. "Do you know what I specifically did last quarter?" I asked. What the project was. What it meant. His eyes moved in the particular way that eyes move when someone is checking for information they're not sure they retained. I told him. The regional network integration. The mortality data. The presentation to the State Health Board in January that had resulted in a policy revision affecting 11 counties. I told him I had sent a summary to the family group chat in February. I told him his response had been a thumbs-up emoji followed immediately by a video of his daughter's school play. He didn't say anything. I told him I had stopped sharing things that mattered to me because they disappeared in this room. They became background. They became the acceptable pause before the conversation returned to something more legible. And when I found someone I loved, someone I was proud of, I made a decision. I kept him private. For the same reason I had stopped explaining my work, or correcting the story Marcus told about me at parties, or defending myself when my father asked when I was going to settle down. I had stopped needing this room to understand me. It had taken years to get there. But I had gotten there. My father, who had been quiet through all of this, said my name once, low and careful. "I'm not angry," I told him. I meant it. I said, "Owen is expecting a call, and I'd rather not be late." Marcus said something as I picked up my coat, something about unfairness, about ambush, about how I couldn't expect people to know things they weren't told. I looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," I said. "You didn't know because I chose not to tell you. And I chose not to tell you because of what happens in this room to things I bring into it. Those two facts can both be true." I walked through my parents' kitchen, past the photographs on the refrigerator, all Marcus, all Dana, all their daughter at various ages, and out through the back door into the November cold, which received me without comment. There is an aftermath. My mother called 4 days later and asked, plainly and without preamble, if she could meet Owen. He said yes before I finished asking. 9 years, he said. I've been very patient. He had been. That was the uncomplicated truth of it. My parents came to Denver in the spring. My father, within 30 minutes of meeting Owen, was asking technical questions about passive solar design that proved he had done research, which undid me completely in a way I concealed by offering to open a second bottle of wine. My mother pulled me into the kitchen after dinner and said, in the quiet voice she uses for things she means, "I'm sorry we made it necessary for you to keep him from us. That was what I needed." I told her so. Marcus and I have talked twice. The second conversation was harder and more honest and ended with him saying in a tone I had never heard from him before, "I didn't realize I was making you smaller. I thought I was worrying about you." I believed him. The hard part was believing him, and also holding at the same time that it had still happened. That not knowing hadn't made it smaller. "I know," I told him. "I think that's probably the part we both have to sit with." On the night of the dinner, I drove home through Columbus streets gone quiet in the way cities go quiet late on a weeknight. Traffic lights cycling for no one. The city doing its maintenance work in the dark. I parked outside the building, sat for a moment in the specific stillness of something long held finally released, and then went inside and called Owen. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have loved about him from the beginning, that quality of attention that doesn't perform itself. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" I thought about it. "I feel like I've been having a conversation in a room with terrible reception for a decade," I said, "and someone finally just picked up the signal." He laughed. Even through the phone I could hear the particular quality of it. "Come home soon," he said. I was already on my way. There are people in our lives who love us in the shape of the version they've invented. They are not always cruel. They are sometimes simply incurious or afraid of what a different version of you might require from them. I spent years deciding that silence was the cost of peace. What I hadn't understood was that the silence had its own cost, quieter, slower, and finally impossible to sustain. Have you ever chosen to protect something you loved by keeping it invisible? And did you ever stop to ask what that protection was actually costing you?